Hold my beer, hold my beer. Whoa, 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 whoa. Let's slow it down a little bit here. Before I get started, hold my beer. Ryan Thomas of the Thomas Take Sports Podcast, live on Spreaker.com, Twitter, Facebook, YouTube. Check it out. Follow me on Twitter at Ryan Thomas Take. Like the Thomas Take Sports Podcast Facebook page. I would greatly appreciate it. I greatly appreciate all the support that has been shown to me these last 3 years since the beginning of the show. You know, really, right around this time 3 years ago, I really was just starting this just to, get my voice out there, see if people were interested. And now it is, my passion. The podcast is my passion. I've really revolved my life around this podcast and building it and making it better and doing whatever I can to put myself out there and be a voice for not just myself, but for others as well, to use their voice. That's always been my quote-unquote credo, is to have a voice for myself, but to give other people a voice as well, and create some talking points and stuff of that nature. So I told you guys yesterday on the Thomas Take Sports Podcast Facebook page that I would be posting some content that'll be going live on Facebook. I'll also be going on the My Fantasy Podcast tonight with Dan Schalk and Brandon Reed. It has been far too long since I've been on that show. Really miss those guys. I really look forward to chatting it up with them. And pardon me if I have to clear my throat at any point during this podcast. Me and my buddy Pat Thompson, we've been friends for, since we were in the second grade. And we were sending snaps to each other and filters and stuff, and I was laughing, and my voice is just not quite there right now, but he had me dying. Shout out to him. Anywho, I want to talk about some, see, there I go. I want to talk about some MMA topics. Obviously, I recapped the Cejudo versus Dillashaw bout, which came with a lot of controversy. Many people wondered if that was an early stoppage. I squashed that. I put my opinion out there right away as soon as I could that this was not an early stoppage, in my opinion. You can dive into that, take it for what it is, appreciate it or not, agree with it or not. That is my take on that issue. I feel as if that was not an early stoppage. Had that not been stopped, TJ Dillashaw would have faced a lot of punishment. It would not have been good. It would have been ugly, and wouldn't have been fun. So that's how I see that fight in a nutshell. But there was a lot more to that I want people to tune into. So you can tune into that on the Thomas Take Sports Podcast YouTube channel. That's the main place for everything involving the Thomas Take Sports Podcast. So, all that being said, there were winners and losers in last Saturday night's fights. The biggest winner, obviously, was Henry Cejudo, but another massive winner of the night was Donald Cowboy Cerrone, the longtime mixed martial artist, WEC, UFC, all-time wins leader in UFC history, more fights under the Zuffa umbrella than any other fighter in Zuffa history, which Zuffa, the company that owned the UFC, that merged with the WEC, has basically owned the top companies inside the sport. So it's safe to say Donald Cerrone stepped into the octagon at the top of the heap of the sport, at the top level of the sport, more than anybody. And I feel like that has definitely got to be respected. I try to come up with a comparison for people that don't know who Donald Cerrone is, for the sports fans out there that might not necessarily be mixed martial arts fans. I would compare Donald Cerrone to Brett Favre in terms of his longevity, in terms of basically being a warrior It's obviously two different sports, but Brett Favre kind of epitomizes the same things that Donald Cerrone epitomizes. True toughness, true discipline, true competitor. And that's how I see Donald Cerrone, and that's obviously how I saw Brett Favre during his football playing career. And I've talked about this before. There's sometimes politics does get involved in how fights are made. Name versus name, ranking versus ranking, or ranking versus name, or name versus ranking. All of those ways, those interchangeable aspects of how a fight gets made is definitely evident. And there will be naysayers to a fight that features a guy that hadn't been in the weight class in 3 years. It's coming off a win over a top 15 opponent, getting a shot against the biggest name in the sport. But that is a narrative that needs to be squashed. The pessimistic idealism of a Conor McGregor, Donald Cerrone fight, I think needs to come to an end. I can only say this, and I say this all the time, but I say this in a way out of respect for others' opinions. I've been a fan of this sport really essentially since it started, as long as I can remember. And there's been fights, like I said, that have been made between two big names for the sake of selling pay-per-views. And then there's been fights that just make sense. There's been fights that fit both opponents. And then there's fights that fit based on ranking, where two guys have something to prove, where two guys are really close to getting a title shot. And then there's a fight like this, where you have Conor McGregor coming off of essentially 2 losses, 3 losses in his last 4 fights. Nate Diaz, he lost. Nate Diaz, he won. Then I always forget the Eddie Alvarez fight because it was such an easy fight for him. But you get the point. Conor McGregor he's kind of in no man's land right now. He's not seen as a title contender anymore. He's not seen as a number 1 contender. Those two claims cannot be made when talking about Conor McGregor. The claim that can be thrown out there when talking about Conor, though, is that he is still the biggest name that this sport has, which offers him the ability to essentially pick whatever fight that he wants. And he earned that right. He earned that narrative. He earned that ability in his fighting career. And I understand that as well as anyone. I get that as well as anyone. I understand that, hey, if Conor McGregor says to Dana White, I want to fight Khabib again, most likely he's going to get that fight. But I think Dana White is one of the smartest guys in the negotiating room at the boardroom table, where he would understand that Khabib is not the best matchup for Conor. That was exposed. That was known. Did Conor do some decent things in that fight? Yes, but they were few and far between. Essentially, it was a 3-1 round drubbing at the hands of Khabib Nurmagomedov. I just watched the fight last night. I did feel as if Herb Dean allowed Khabib Nurmagomedov to be on top of Conor in the first round, especially, for far too long. Did he have both legs wound up? Yes, he did, but I felt like Khabib could have easily been stood up due to no action. No punches were being thrown, just positioning. And after a while, after 4 minutes, if you can't get that position even in 2 minutes, that needs to be stood up. Conor McGregor would have earned the right for that fight to be stood up in the first round. But that's not how it went down. The second round was more of the same. Second round was the worst round, I think, of Conor's career. He got dropped. He got taken down, almost pretty much slammed in midair. Third round, Conor kind of got his footing back, and Khabib kind of dialed back and, got the air in his lungs back a little bit. And then in the fourth round, Khabib really essentially did what he did in rounds 1 and 2 and ultimately took Conor McGregor's back and got a submission, and that was that. That's really my summarization of Khabib versus Conor. And Habib's the top. He's undefeated. He's 27-0. He's number one. Conor, coming off that loss, I feel as if he needs to take a fight that can get him back into the win column. And I'm not saying a gimme fight. I'm not saying, give Conor McGregor an easy opponent. If you want to say that Donald Cerrone is an easy opponent, if you want to say that Cerrone is an easy fight for Conor, you know nothing about mixed martial arts. You know nothing about the UFC. Anything can happen. And if there was ever a fighter that understands the importance, the severity of this fight, it would be Donald Cerrone. And that is largely why Cerrone has lost some of the big fights in his career. He overviews the importance. He overstates the importance of the fights and almost psychs himself out. Whereas Conor McGregor is known to psych his opponents out with trash talk. Cerrone can handle the trash talk. He doesn't like it, but he can handle it. Really what Cerrone's weakness is essentially his mindset walking out of the locker room. If one thing is off, it can really throw Cerrone for a loop. So I think that those days, though, are hopefully done for Donald Cerrone. I'd like to see him make a run on 155 pounds due to the fact that he's been one of the true icons of the sport for the last 10 years. It would be cool to see, it'd be special to see him finally get that new UFC belt around his waist, which I'm not a big fan of the UFC belts. But anywho, this fight simply makes sense. You have Conor coming off a loss. You have Cerrone, who's been a name in MMA for the last 10 years, has fought the who's who, has fought everyone. I feel like Donald Cerrone deserves the opportunity to get the biggest payday of his career. You're doing Cerrone a huge service. And I look at this, obviously the situation was a little bit different, but I look at this similarly to Bisping versus St. Pierre. Bisping gave everything to the UFC. St. Pierre gave everything to the UFC. St. Pierre brought the UFC to a new level. McGregor kind of piggybacked off that and brought it to an even higher level, whereas Cerrone was that company man that Michael Bisping was, and then some. So I see this as a very similar fight. The fans do not give a rat's if there's a title on the line or an interim title. Please do not do that, UFC. I know that they probably won't, but please don't. If there's anyone listening involved in mixed martial arts at the highest level in the UFC, working for the UFC, do not allow McGregor versus Cerrone to be an interim title fight. Make it 5 rounds, make it a main event, and let's just see these two guys go to war and offer us one of the best fights humanly possible, which I think that this fight would produce. This fight would be backyard brawling between McGregor and Cerrone. And maybe McGregor has more technique. Maybe McGregor is more refined. Maybe Cerrone is more of a kickboxer-esque guy. I think that terminology was pretty vague. But what I mean by that is Cerrone is not throwing the craziest techniques in the world. Does he have technique? Of course he does. But Conor McGregor is elusive. He's rangy. He's got great boxing. For Pete's sake, the guy went 10 rounds with Floyd Mayweather. So that needs to be stated. I definitely feel as if this fight should happen. I don't feel like McGregor is in a position to fight any of the younger guys at 155. I feel like there's certain fights that make sense for Conor, and those fights are few and far between. Nate Diaz 3 obviously is one of those fights. But if we're not going to get Nate Diaz and Conor McGregor 3, we should get McGregor versus Cerrone 1. That's all. That's all I got to say. Drop the mic. UFC 2019, let's go big. Let's go McGregor, Cerrone, two of the biggest names that the 155-pound division has ever had, two of the most game fighters in mixed martial arts history, and two fighters that really need each other right now. McGregor needs to get a name opponent that he can possibly get a W off of, that can bring out this old Conor McGregor, the old school trash talk, rock'em sock'em robots fighting style that made him the famous fighter that he is today. Donald Cerrone deserves the payday and deserves to be seen by the biggest audience possible. And the biggest audience possible will be watching Conor McGregor fight